have been really a resounding success, and we today have another incredible guest speaker. It's a real privilege to have Heather here today. And I just want to know, how's everybody doing? Are there thumbs up happening? Everybody? Yes? Yeah, good. I think at least things are easing up in Melbourne. We've got sunny skies and the birds are chirping and enjoying this quiet time. So I think that's a good thing. So all of you put your feet up, brew up some coffee, and let's get started. As you all know by now, I'm Jackie Chait. I'm the Legacy Manager for JNF Victoria. And as always, I say that leaving a bequest is an incredibly meaningful and benevolent thing to do, especially for the generations to come. We are currently finishing off our Blue Box project. And although there's been change in circumstances, our extended JNF family and community have been incredibly benevolent and generous. So please feel free to contact me for any confidential chat about our current projects, our imminent projects, and of course, leaving a bequest. The house rules, as you know from previous events, we just have everyone on mute until the end, when there will be plenty of time for questioning. The good thing about Zoom, amongst others, is that we're not under strict time constraints to get out of a hall and pack up. So we're not under any particular rush. So there will be time for questions at the end. And now for our remarkable guest speaker today, Heather Morris. Heather is the author of internationally best-selling novels, The Tattooist of Auschwitz and Cilka's Journey. She grew up on a farm in rural New Zealand, as you'll hear from her accent, which is beautiful. And on her way across the paddocks from school, she would visit her great-grandfather and listen to his experiences of war, stories he told only Heather. And from a young age, she realized that people would tell their stories if she stopped and listened. Heather now lives and works in Melbourne. In 2003, she met Lael Sokolov, a meeting that changed both of their lives. As their friendship grew, he entrusted her with the task of telling the world the innermost details of his life during the Holocaust. The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which Heather has just updated me, had been the #1, the New York Times bestseller for 31 weeks straight, and has sold over 6 million copies worldwide and has been published in over 55 territories around the globe. That is a massive achievement, a massive achievement. It's also been translated, did you say 47 into 47?
Yes, 47 languages.
47 different languages. I didn't even know there were 47 languages.
There you go.
In 1942, Lael Sokolov arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was given the terrible task of tattooing the prisoners marked for survival, scratching numbers into his fellow victims' arms in indelible ink that would become one of the most potent symbols of the Holocaust. Waiting in line to be tattooed, terrified and shaking, was a young girl, and for Lael it was love at first sight. And he was determined not only to survive himself, but to ensure that this woman, Gita, did too. Her sequel to the acclaimed Tattooist of Auschwitz, Cilka's Journey, tells the story of Cilka, who is just 16 years old when taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The commandant at Birkenau notices her long, beautiful hair and forces her separation from the other women prisoners. And Cilka learns quickly that power, even unwillingly obtained, equals survival. In Heather's third and upcoming novel, Stories of Hope, she will explore the art of listening. This is the skill she employed when she met Lael Sokolov. Stories of Hope will examine Heather's extraordinary journey in the form of a series of beautifully rendered tales of the people she has met, the remarkable stories they've shared with her, and the lessons they hold for us all. So now over to the wonderful Heather.
Oh, thank you so much, Jackie. Look, it's an absolute delight to be chatting with you today, and I wish it was in person, but we live in very different times, don't we? I was just saying I look forward to the day when I not only have to put a decent top on, but I can get out of these track pants that I'm wearing that you can't see. But yeah, look, the Tattooist of Auschwitz, of course, it's had a phenomenal success, and now Cilka is starting to gather that momentum as well. It's coming out in paperback in the US and in the UK in September. It's been in hardcover in those countries and done amazingly well, and once again selling in other territories. But why did I have to tell this story? You know, I made 2 promises to Lali. One of them I made 2 hours before he died, when I knew he wasn't going to see the sun come up the next day. And that was that I would never, ever stop trying to tell his story. The other promise I made him many, many times, because he made me promise. When I had told his story, and he always made sure I would agree to tell his story first, that I would then tell Cilka's. To him, she was the bravest person, and he'd wag his finger at me and say, not the bravest girl, but the bravest person he ever knew. When he spoke about her, he would become very, very emotional. What happened to her and how he felt as a man, knowing what was happening to her. And I'm talking about the sexual abuse being carried out not only in Birkenau, but he knew what had happened to her when she went to Siberia.
I think we've lost the connection there.
It was something that he seemed to never forgive himself for not being able to do something about. Oh dear. Can you hear me?
No, so I think maybe you need.
Are you able to hear me, Jackie? You're frozen. Mariella?
I can hear you. Are you?
Yeah, okay.
It's come good now, I think.
It was, yeah.
There are men working outside my property and they're working on lines down there. If they touch my NBN connection, which is not the best at the best of times, I'll get really cranky. Okay, I've got that off my chest.
Let's keep going, see how long we can hold out for.
Well, I'll just repeat why I told Cilka's story was because of this promise to Lally that I would tell her story. But it wasn't the same for me to be able to tell her story. Cilka died in 2004, so there was no way I was going to be able to get her permission. And I'm jumping around a bit. Am I still with you?
Yes.
Okay. Something's going on with my Zoomy thing, but I'll keep talking. Somebody please just indicate to me if I drop out again. And I do apologize for this. I'm going to pretend I'm live all the time. As I was saying, getting her story and telling her story was quite different for me. Lally, of course, I had him. He was in my life for 3 years. And not just telling his story, but as my friend. And he called me his friend too. In fact, he called me more than his friend. Part of him being the charmer that he was to take me often to social events with his community. And he would introduce me as his girlfriend. He would joke with my husband, she may be your wife, but she's my girlfriend, you know. You know, Steve often told her, you want her, you can have her. But that was my relationship with Lally, and it was intense, it was beautiful. And it existed, as I say, up until 2 hours before he died, when I was with him alone. And said those words to him, I will never, ever stop trying to tell your story. I couldn't do that with Cilka. But I had Lally telling me about her. I had Geeta talking about her on her shower tape. I met some other survivors that Lally introduced me to, and they told me the bits they knew about her survival in Auschwitz-Birkenau. But that's only part of her story. Once I had that together and I could formulate a pretty good picture of what this young girl, 16, she was just 16, guys, what she endured for nearly 3 years. I then needed to go and look for the second part to her story, and then the third part. Well, to get the second part meant going or having somebody in Russia to help me. I thought about going there, but it was their winter when I was at that point of needing to research, and yeah, I'm not really that kind of cold weather person. So I did the next best thing, and I engaged a professional researcher in Moscow. Actually, it was probably the best thing because I don't speak the language. And this lady, Svetlana, she was able to provide me through the archives in Moscow an incredible number of documents, information, testimonies of women who were in Vorkuta Gulag. And I was really clear, I only want to know about Vorkuta Gulag. No other Gulag, there's hundreds of them, just the one. I didn't want it to be colored by what was going on in other Gulags. You know, Vorkuta is 160 kilometers inside the Arctic Circle, one of the coldest places on Earth. The permafrost there is 6 foot deep, even in summer. And that is where Cilka spent 10 years. I was given not only photos of the place and the information about that. It's still an operating coal mine, by the way, because that's what it was, a coal mine, and still exists today. Now, at one point, Svetlana wrote to me and she said, look, I've exhausted all the documents that are in the archives in Moscow, and I've been told that there are many more still being held in Vorkuta. So I said to her, okay, well, look, can you just nip up there and see what you can get for me? And she wrote back saying, oh, please don't ask me to do that. Because from Moscow, Vorkuta is a 3-day train trip. And this is on a very fast train now, 3 days. In, 3 days out. There's no hotel accommodation. The township of it exists only to support those now working in the coal mine. And I'm told that the vast majority of people who now work and live in Vorkuta still were originally, or their families were, prisoners in that gulag. So I excused her. She'd got me enough. Can I tell you what I learned about life in Vorkuta just still chills me to the bone. And not because of the climate, but the evil, horrible place it was, like so many other gulags. But I had to read this information. And when I was talking with Lally, whenever I got upset with what I was hearing about the Holocaust, I could go to him and he would comfort me. Or I would go to the amazing people I worked with at Monash Medical Centre, including one, Natalie Wester, and get comforted from them and Lally. And I didn't have that, and reading about what Cilka's life was like. So what I can say is that my husband and dog got yelled at a lot, but it was a matter of whatever was going to get me through reading the next terrible testimony of these brave women who made them. Now I had the picture of her life there. I already had learnt bits from Lally, from Gita, and from other people here in Australia, and from a researcher in Slovakia. But then, of course, I needed to speak to people who knew her. And I've made several trips now back into Slovakia, to Košice, where she lived for over 40 years with the man that she met in that gulag and married and spent all those decades with. I sat in the very apartment that she had lived in for those 40 plus years. The new owners let me come in and sit there. I then went next door and sat in the apartment of 94 and 92-year-old Mr. and Mrs. Samueli. They moved in the same day in the 1960s as Cilka and her husband did. They were their friends all those years. And people from this apartment building who had been told there's this crazy lady from Australia is coming down and she wants to talk about Cecilia, because I only ever heard and knew her as Cecilia. Cilka killed off that name of hers. Was never known by that again when she returned from the gulag. Now they came in and out of that apartment for the many hours I was there with the 2 translators, sharing their stories of this beautiful woman they had known for decades. And what they described to me really, look, it did astound me to think that she could have lived 3 years in Auschwitz now, 10 years in a gulag, and still remain this woman who not only was so loving, but was loved by so many in return. She had no children of her own, and Mrs. Samueli, through the translator, told me that was the thing that saddened her the most, that she was never able to have children. But then these people, these men and women in their 40s and 50s and 60s, are telling me, but she was our other mother. Every afternoon, when they were children, they came home from school, particularly in winter. And trust me, Košice has a very harsh winter. She would be outside, and any of those children who could not get into the apartment because their parents were still at work, she took them into her apartment. She gave them warm drinks. She kept them there because their parents knew exactly whose door to knock on to find their children when they came home from work. This is the amazing lady now being described to me by people who knew her for decades. And I was able then to totally get a feeling of this woman and the strength that she had to be able to then work out what was it about her as a 16-year-old that enabled her to continue to survive. You know, the Slovakian authorities actually even came on board. It's quite wonderful how they actually allowed me to see documents that I really have no right to. And I'm talking about personal documents. And for a country still living under the shadow of communism, to allow me to go and sit in bureaucratic offices and be shown her birth details, these huge big journals with all the details about her birth and her parents and her grandparents, her parents' marriage details, her sister's details, all these documents that existed. And from there I went, that was in a little town called Sabinov. That was where she in fact was born. But she didn't grow up there, and she spent her most of her years in another town called Bartishov. And for any Slovakians listening, I apologize for my pronunciation of these amazing, beautiful towns that I am now becoming very familiar with. And when I went to Bartishov, I was taken into another government department, and I was shown her last 2 years' school records, and also her sister's. And I can tell you she was very good at maths and science. She had very good manners, and she was very well behaved. I would have liked to have seen those comments on my own children's school reports. They were on hers. I can tell you, older sister Olga, not so well behaved. But it was wonderful that they let me see these documents and have them translated. In fact, they even photographed them. The other details about births and deaths and marriages, I wasn't allowed to photograph. And fair enough too. From there, I went and stood outside the very house that Cilka had lived in and was taken from with her family. It's still there in the old village part of Bartishov. And to be able to stand there and look up the 2 windows above, it's a single door and 2 windows above, and wonder which one of those was the bedroom that Cilka slept in. Very, very moving. There was some workmen, and they were working on the property right next door, carpenters, and they had some music playing, and this I remember so vividly. Beautiful, haunting music. And I said to the translators, 2 of them in particular who come with me there, they're now my friends, Anna and Linka. And I said, what's that music? And they went, that's Ukrainian love songs. Because Bartishov is quite close to the Ukrainian border. And it explained why. And I said, well, how did people like Lali and Cilka speak so many languages? And they said, well, everybody did back then. Of course, they had to speak Hungarian. They were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time. They got Slovakian, they got Ukrainian, Russian because of the borders, and it's just what they did. And here was Ukrainian love songs being played next door to her house. And from there, the most poignant and most amazing memory I have of being in Bartishov was being taken to, well, the 2 synagogues, the one where Cilka and her family would have worshipped, which is now in ruins. There is hope. And there's a person, one man in particular in Bartishov, who is trying to recreate the lives and remember the lives of all the Jewish people from Bartishov who never returned. It's got the name of the town is the town of all the lost Jews. So few, if any, now live there. This one particular man is trying to remember them. So he is having, hopefully, fundraising to rebuild as best he can this old synagogue. I went into it, even though it was considered a health hazard with part of the floor missing and the ceiling and unstable staircases, but they let me go in. Next door to it is a small little synagogue. We approached it. As we were walking towards it, I heard music being played, and I could see workmen around the area because there was some construction going on. And I thought, wow, that's really loud music to be playing in such a solemn place. And my publisher from London was with me. Her and I were walking. But as we approached it, it got louder. And it was hauntingly beautiful again. And we walked into what I call the vestry. I'm not sure what the little entry into the synagogue is. And it's only a small room inside the synagogue. But when we walked in there was this choir. It wasn't somebody playing music. It was a choir of young boys and girls, teenagers. And they had 2 people on instruments accompanying them. I swear, it was the most beautiful, beautiful music I have heard. And to hear it coming from these amazing young voices, it was bouncing off the walls. I froze, and my publisher beside me, wasn't aware she was there until I felt her hand take mine. And we looked at each other and tears were streaming down our eyes. The beauty of being in this place, which is so significant to Cilka. On the back wall, after we sort of recovered from that, we were shown lots of other documents and things there. And it's a sad thing, isn't it, that behind a wall, because of this threat of vandalism and damage, they had created a very small little garden. And it was in the middle of summer last year, but it was blooming beautifully and the grass was green. There's a marble wall, and on that marble wall, they have the names of everybody from Bardashev who did not survive the Holocaust. And there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And there we were shown the Klein family, and there was Cilka's name. Because according to every document, every database that exists, Cilka did not survive. And this becomes part of the whole issue of, history and memory, fact and fiction. Because when we were going through that whole process of telling her story, and when I say we, I'm talking about my publishers, we looked up databases at Yad and Auschwitz Museum and the United States Holocaust Museum, and we found Cilka's name there and her date of birth, and clearly identified as her on these databases. Every single one of them then had the 3 words, murdered in Auschwitz. Well, that's a bit of a concern, isn't it, when I'm about to release a book that says, no, she wasn't. And how do I prove that? Well, I was able to prove it by, of course, getting her death details and getting her marriage details and getting the documents. And while we still struggled to say, well, anybody could have done that, I'm going to just jump back to looking at that birth registration of hers in Sabin.
Can I just interrupt? The sound is very staccato. Are you able to sort of shift? Maybe it's just where you're sitting.
I've got a microphone, which is quite a high quality one, right in front of me.
It may just be that they're busy with your NBN connection. So it's going.
I can hear them. There's machinery going on out there. I'm wondering where I should go and tell them to go away.
Tell them to.
How bad is it?
Now it's okay. Can everybody hear?
Yeah, okay. All righty. I'll keep going.
Okay.
Because, as I say, we needed to have it. We were wondering, how can we prove this, that we will be criticised for telling a story about a woman who is considered to have not survived the Holocaust. But on that day, I looked at her birth registration in Sabinov, and I saw, the date she was born, her full name, her mum's name, her dad's name, her grandparents' name, her dad's occupation. All that beautiful information was there. And it was quite funny initially. The bureaucrat had opened this huge big journal that had 200 years worth of births registered in Sabinov in it. She covered up the names above and below Cilka's with just white paper, as if somehow I would be reading names. I couldn't read the language. How would I possibly get that? But anyway, I noticed at the end of her registration, because it went over 2 big pages, something seemed to be written in another language, not another language, another pen in another time. And didn't take much notice because we had all the relevant information we wanted. And then the bureaucrat got up. She said, look, let me go and get the book that has all the marriage details in it. And when she got up, I quickly flipped through pages to see if anybody else had something else written in a different pen in a different time. And nobody did. So I called back my translator, Anna, and I said, Anna, please tell me what it says there. What's that last inscription? And poor Anna, she nearly collapsed. And she said, oh my goodness, we found it. We've got what we want. And there written, the wording, I'll try and get it as close to exact as I can remember because they wouldn't let me photograph it. On this day in 1958, Cecilia Klein visited this office, bringing with her the relevant document from the government in Bratislava, declaring her to be alive, declaring her to be a citizen of the state of Czechoslovakia. She went back to a town where she was born, not even the town that she lived in, and she made them note on her birth details she was alive. And we wondered, why did she do that? And the bureaucrat she came up with, I can only imagine it was because she wanted to get married or she wanted a job. Now we know that she worked for the government in Košice, so she needed to have that proof. So thank you, Cilka. Thank you, Cecilia. And so we are able to contact, and we have the databases of Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Museum, and say, you can amend your records. Cecilia Klein lived. And what's lovely is they're grateful. They appreciate it when you do provide the evidence that they can adjust on their databases. I tend to go off a little bit here about why I'm telling this story, because it's important for me that you know that I did not go crash bang into wanting to write a second novel and try and just feed off the success of Lali's story. That I did do the due diligence in talking to people and visiting places and having professional researchers find out what we could. Mm-hmm. And the story I have told, of course, I've had to be creative in some of those parts of her life, but am I being creative about what happened to her in, say, the Gulag in particular? That has come from testimonies and documents of people who were there. I did not have to create them. I don't think I have the ability to create that horror. I'd like to think I didn't. So Cilka's journey and Cilka's story, look, I've honored my promise to Lali to tell the world about the bravest girl he ever knew. And again, it comes back to the old history and memory issues, doesn't it? And yes, there has been some criticisms of my stories for not always appreciating the fact that there are facts out there that do not gel. Now, the one thing I'm really, really clear when I'm speaking to anybody or any group is that I have not told the story of the Holocaust. I've told a Holocaust story, just the one, Lali's, Gita's, and part of Cilka's. I cannot know, no one can know of the absolute horror and terror that young girl was endured during her time in Birkenau. For anyone who has read it, and you have read about her mother being in Birkenau and her being with her mother, I did not create that. That came from people who knew. And as horrible as it was for me to have to write that, she was there, and that's how it happened. Some of the testimonies that we've read of Cilka from other Auschwitz survivors have not been very glowing at all. In fact, they're highly critical of her behaviour in choosing to survive in the way that she did. My words are quite simple: do not judge. I will not. And I know that other survivors, maybe they do have a right to judge, and I will grant them that. But I will not, and I don't think anybody who wasn't there gets to do that either. And I can be quite outspoken about that occasionally. And there's one other aspect of Cilka's survival, more so in the Gulag, that I'm quite outspoken about. And also her time in Auschwitz and Birkenau. And again, it has come from receiving some criticism about the fact that I have dared to mention that she, and we now know many, many, many other women and girls were sexually abused. When I read a lot of the material my publishers obtained about why this aspect of the Holocaust has not had anywhere near the mention that it should, that does seem, and we have found evidence from historians and academics, that they thought to bring that aspect of survival, or in many cases not survival in the Holocaust, and to highlight that was not what they thought the Holocaust should be remembered for. That it was the totality and the horror and the deaths and the murders of the Holocaust that would be spoken about, not the sexual abuse. And part of their rationale, which I get at one level, but only one small level only, was that they felt that in talking about it, they would bring shame to the women who endured that abuse. Well, to me, I'm ashamed. And I feel that we should be ashamed that we have allowed these women to live for decades hiding the truth of what has happened to them and what happened to them back then. And we received from medical articles or their mental health articles, particularly from Canada, where they have been looking at Holocaust survivors in their 90s now in nursing homes, who, because of an element of dementia, have lost that ability to self-filter and are now horrifying their families and carers and now remembering and talking about the abuse they suffered. And yeah, they were shamed into being silent, and they no longer can be silent. So yes, that's a little bit of a crusade of mine, because I kind of think we have to talk about it. We don't have to make a big deal of it, but no longer should we turn away from what they endured and suffered. And when I was asked, well, why didn't they talk about it? Many of them, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of women have made testimonies, and it's not been mentioned in them. And we've tried trying to find many of the ones in English that we can see. And yes, there is no mention of being abused, sexually abused. But you know what? They weren't asked the question either. And when these elderly women now are talking about it and they're asked, why haven't you said something sooner? They have always said, because nobody asked me. So I'm just wanting to cover that up because, yes, it's something which, again, I have received some criticism for. Why are you mentioning this? Why are you bringing it up? Why are you shining a light on the shame that these women have carried with them? And I kind of say, you know what? In the last 2 or 3 years, educated professional women around the world have finally spoken up and said, me too. Now, if they, in this day and age, in an educated professional sense, have been shamed into silence, what chance did these young girls and women ever have of being able to speak up? So let me move on from that, because it's not what Cilka's story is about, and I don't want that to be about that. But it's important for me that I do mention it and that I wrote about it in the book. And I talk about it now in the hope that others will too. But in telling her story and in researching her story, and like Lully's, can I say that territories around the world are absolutely gravitating towards it. And once again, I don't have the latest figures of its translations, but it's 30 plus at this moment and counting. Actually, one of the first countries that took it was my Russian publisher. I felt sure he wouldn't, and he would go, I'm not touching the Gulag, because I don't really have much nice to say about them during that time. But no, we're hearing from the publishers in Russia and the Ukraine, and it's several the Estonian countries too, or the Latvian countries, that they are saying, hey, here's a chance for books written in a fictionalized sense to now shine a light on the Gulag system, and maybe other stories will come out. I have been absolutely astounded by the number of emails I've got from people in the USA. It doesn't say much about their education there, can I say, who have written and saying, what's a Gulag? I had no idea these things called Gulags existed. And I'm going, oh my, I was educated in small town New Zealand, and I knew the word Siberian Gulag. I think my mother used to threaten to send me there when I wouldn't let me know. But yes, the number of people who know nothing about that system of forced labour, terrorised labour that went from the 1930s to about 1960. And yeah, they're hoping more stories will now emerge. Well, the more the merrier. So this is why Cilka's story is important to me, because it shines a light on another aspect of our history that needs to be talked about. I guess it begs the question, who the heck do I think I am to be the person to do this? I make no claim to have any expertise in telling these stories. I'm just the lucky person who got to meet Lully Sokolov, who then got to hear about Cilka. And as you mentioned, because of that luck that came my way, so did thousands of emails from people all around the world who wrote to me from as young as 9 years of age and telling me what reading Lully and now Cilka's story has done to them in their lives. In particular, they used the word hope. In a time of tragedy and trauma in my life, you have given me hope that I too want to wake up tomorrow. Until I read your story, I didn't, because of something really, really horrific that had happened to them or a member of their family. And one of the most recent ones, 3 or 4 weeks ago, an email from a 20-year-old young man living in Milan in Italy. He wrote to me because he said he lived in an apartment, and Milan was one of the hardest hit cities in Italy with regard to coronavirus deaths. And he wrote to me saying, my friends, my neighbors, my family are dying all around me. I cannot leave my apartment. I have lost my grandparents, my neighbors, and I didn't know what to do until 3 days ago when my 16-year-old sister gave me your book.
I can't hear you.
Oh, anybody else having that problem? No, okay. I'm sorry, honey. I'll get close. I'll move the microphone right in here. Is that better? How is that? Yeah.
Just for everyone who's watching, we're recording this, so we can share the link afterwards if people are having technical issues as well.
Yeah. I'm sorry about that. I've been doing quite a few of these, and yeah, occasionally we have our hiccups. But I'm just telling you, is that Bella, is it, who's having trouble hearing? No, okay. But let me tell you about this young 20-year-old boy. As I say, his 16-year-old sister gave him my book to read. He said, I never slept until I finished your book. And I now know that I am going to survive, and I am going to now lead the best life I can, because I owe it to all these people around me who have not survived. A month ago, current times, a young man in Milan in Italy. Now, when you hear stories like that, and I've been hearing them now for 2 years, it then, well, to me and my publishers, it became the next thing I had to do, which was to tell what you introduced me at, Jackie's having written this short book. It's not a long book like Tattooist or even Cilka. I'm going to show you the cover. This is not the book. I've just wrapped it around another book, but it is called Stories of Hope. And in here I talk, it's my story. This is my story. So it's non-fiction. It's my telling you what, as you said, listening to my great-grandfather. By the way, the war that my great-grandfather spoke to me about as a young girl was the Boer War in South Africa. He went there as a 16-year-old lad from New Zealand, along with his brother, and his survival there. And for some reason, I think because I was the only girl, I had 4 brothers, he called me girly, and he wanted me to come and sit with him, a man well into his 80s at that point, every afternoon after school, and he would just sit and talk to me, and I would listen. He taught me how to listen. Sometimes he would just say to me, by the way, we don't talk today. Let's just listen to what's going on around us. And being in rural New Zealand, that was often the sound of what was dairy farms, like cows mooing, the dogs yapping, rounding them up, the odd tractor going down the road, and more often than not, my mother yelling at my younger brothers. But he would say, just sit and listen, and we would. And a lot of bird life. There's a lot of bird life there. So in hearing him, and in hearing Lully, and in hearing another lovely ladies I'll talk to you about in a moment, because it's this trilogy. It'll be my 3rd story, my 3rd book. And these people who contacted me, they said to me, why don't you write about that? And so I have. Let me just tell you one more story that has come to me as a result of Lully's story coming out. It was about a year ago. I got an email, and it was from a warden in a prison south of London. Now, when you get an email and it's clearly from a prison, you say, thank goodness I'm not in that country. They're not looking for me. I read this email, and he said that this was a maximum security prison, 1,500 men, and about half a dozen of the men had read Lully's story. They had a little library there, and these men had read it. And the warden wrote and told me, we have never seen a book have an impact on prisoners like this has. I'd never written to an author before. These men were going out and sharing their version of Lali's story with other prisoners. And they were using phrases apparently like, there's this dude called Lali, and he was in a prison way worse than ours. He survived, and when he got out, he had a good life. So maybe there's hope for us to have a good life when we're released. And they were being heard saying when other prisoners were getting upset, just be like Lali. So this was happening in a prison. And he wrote and told me, and he asked me, could I write back? And he would arrange it. They had a weekly newsletter thing that went out to them. He would write back, he would print anything I wrote. So I wrote back and I said, well, actually, I'm coming to London. Can I stop off and have a cup of tea, maybe? I thought, well, there's nothing wrong inviting yourself for a cup of tea, is there? Well, sometimes being ignorant about these things actually can pay off, because the prison authorities and my publishers made it happen. And about 6 weeks later, after many, inspections, everything being taken from me, x-rays, I got to tell you, getting into a maximum security prison, even not as a prisoner, is not the easiest, but we endured it. I could take nothing with me, not even a pen. And I was taken into a room, and a short while later, 100 very naughty boys and men, and they weren't in that prison because they'd stolen a loaf of bread. They came in, sauntered in, really casual and laid back. Now, all they had to sit on were plastic cubes. So they walked in and they started sitting on there and they're jiving each other and carrying on. And I had thought, oh, well, I'll do a talk like I'm doing to you. And then I'd have this kind of structured talk. Within about 2 minutes, I knew I was no longer running the show. And I had 6 guards behind me. They were not needed, not at all. But for the next 2 hours, I ended up just moving in amongst these men, pushing one off this little cube and sitting with another half-assed men as they all just talked and included me or talked amongst themselves. And they were sharing stories of themselves. Many of them were actually openly weeping, talking about their family outside. And I was watching prisoners comforting prisoners. And the guards and the warden that was there were saying, we have not seen this happen before. What on earth is going on? But we just let it roll, and we let it roll for 2 hours, way beyond the time I was meant to. And then they called on it, and they said to the men, there's 100 copies of the book over there. If you'd like one, go and get it, because publishers have sent them with me. They were picking up the book, and one of the men came to me and he handed it to me, and he said, oh, would I write it? Would I write in it? Well, I had to get a pen. No, he gave me his name and I wrote best wishes. But then a young man behind him handed me his book. And I said, hi, what's your name? And he said, I can't read. That froze me for a second. And then he said, would you make it out to my mum? I said, of course, give me your mum's name. He did, and I wrote his mother's name. And then he said to me, would you please, I'm sorry, Mum, I promise I'll never come back inside again. So I wrote those words. And the man behind him, and the man behind him, and on it went for another hour as I was handed books, not to dedicate to the person in front of me, but to the most significant person in their lives outside. When someone has your book and says to my 16-year-old daughter and tell her how proud Daddy is, she has a job interview. Wow, that packs a punch. To my wife, I'm sorry she's bringing the kids up on her own. To my partner, and then whispered, does it matter that it's a man? And on it went. Even the guards that were there with me were struggling emotionally. I could hear them sniffling in the back. And I made one mistake that day, just the one. One of the men had standing in front of me, had his book, and he said, would you write it to my daughter? She's 3 and I've never met her. She was born after I came inside. And so I got her name and he said, just write, I promise to be the best daddy in the world when I get out. Now, after I'd written that, I looked up at him and tears were streaming down his face. So I looked at him and I said, would you like a hug? And he went, yeah. So I got up, because I was sitting down. I got up and I gave him a hug. But the man next to him said, "Can I have one too?" And the man next to him said, "Can I have one too?" About 20 hugs later, a guard came up behind me and went, "Excuse me, love, I haven't touched a lady in a long time." So we kind of ended the hugs for that day. But after I had lunch with 6 of the men who were chosen to have lunch with me, yeah, I've eaten prison grub. I went and lined up with them and had it slopped on my tray, just like you see in the movies. But we did sit down in a quiet room and eat it. When these things happen to you, you kind of go, I'm changed by these events. And yeah, whether you want to hear them or not, I'm going to tell you, I'll tell anybody, because the power of words being written does not end, in my case, the day the books get released on the bookshelves. Quite the opposite. They are going on and on and on. And while I've spoken to you about stories of hope, let me tell you about the one that will follow that. I was in Johannesburg in June, July last year. Can't quite remember. I was there at a book festival. No, actually, I was actually in a little town called Franschhoek. Don't know if any of you know South Africa, but Franschhoek, it's the wine region. Very nice too. And I got, one night I came back late to my room, opened an email, and it was from a man who had written to me. He lives in Canada. He was going to visit his mother who lives in Tel Aviv. He picked up my book because Canada, thankfully, I would never have this story otherwise, only 3 countries in the world have the same cover, this cover. Australia, Canada, and Brazil. Every other country make up their own cover. Amazing covers, wonderful, wonderful covers. But Canada had that. He picked it up at Toronto Airport, got to Tel Aviv, and the next day he hadn't finished reading it, and he came out into his mother's lounge room and he put it down on the coffee table, and he wrote to me saying, my mother walked past, looked down at the cover of the book and simply said, that must be about Lali and Gita. Well, reading this and even telling you about it now, I got chills, and I get chills. And the short story is, this 93-year-old lady, her number is 3 apart from Gita's. Her older sister Sibby's is 2 apart. She and her 2 sisters came from the same town, Vranov Nartopolo in Slovakia, where Gita came from. They went to school with Gita. They were on the same train going to Auschwitz with Gita. They remembered Lali tattooing them. Now, not only did they share that experience in Auschwitz-Birkenau with Gita for nearly 3 years, but their friendship, they were being Slovakian, of course, they, in fact, Gita had gone and stayed with them in Israel on 2 or 3 occasions. So I get this email, and I write back, and then they write back, and they share some more, and then I get an email saying, Livia, that's the name of this gentleman's mum, Livia wants to talk to you, would you ring her? So I had then made it, I think, to Cape Town, and I rang her and had a chat to her, and her words were, I need to talk to you. Can you please come and see me? I got to Johannesburg the next day, and I went, better get in touch with my publishers in London and tell them. So I sent them this chain of emails, and I rang up Kate in London, and I said, I need to speak to her. I need to meet with her. And Kate said, well, all right, off you go. And I said, okay, well, I'm going home tomorrow, and then I'll arrange to go to Israel. And Kate said, oh, no, you won't. She said, we're going to reroute you straight from Johannesburg. You won't go back to Melbourne. So my family got a message from me saying not coming home. I then had to say to her, but Kate, I can't go to Israel. I've run out of clean knickers. Well, she pointed out to me that it was well within her wherewithal to courier clean knickers to me in Tel Aviv. And once she organised the hotel for me to stay in. We did compromise on my then learning how to wash my own knickers, by the way. So, yeah, I know too much information, but that's okay. So I then found myself, less than 48 hours later, in the apartment of 93-year-old Livia. I spent 2 days with her son and daughter-in-law, and their adult grandchildren, and met other family members of hers. And after those 2 days, they said to me, you need to go to Jerusalem. And here's my ignorance, guys. I went, okay, well, I'll come back and then I'm sure I'll find time to go to Jerusalem. And I went, well, why can't you go tomorrow? Take a day off and go down to Jerusalem. I said, oh, no, it's too far. Well, those of you who know that it's not very far between these two cities can appreciate my going being astounded when I was told, get a driver, you'll be in there in less than an hour. So I did. On that third day, I spent that day down in Jerusalem, and that's when I spent time at Yad Vashem and met the people there who are part of the people who are responsible for selling the book in the bookshop and other people connected to Yad Vashem. But when I went back the next day to spend time with her and her family, they had got me out of town for a reason. On the day that I was absent, they got to get every adult member of those three sisters. One of them is still alive, the middle sister. She's still alive. She's now 96. The older sister, she died a couple of years ago. But her two sons and their wives and all the three girls all had two children each. They all got together, and the ones who I met persuaded the rest of the family members to say, we have to ask her to write the story of the sisters. So when I arrived back on that fourth day, I was presented with, we as a family want you to tell a story, and would you do it? Of course, initially I kind of said, I'd love to. We need to just work through, of course, the logistics of all this. And we did work through them. And in January, I was back in Tel Aviv. I spent another week with the family. And this time with Maida. Maida doesn't speak English. Lydia does, because she lived in London for a few years. But sitting with this 94 or 96-year-old lady is, wow, how privileged am I? Now, their story, I know you're thinking, is this another Holocaust story? Well, yes, it is. And no, it's not. Because these three sisters, 15, 17, and 19, not only all survived the Holocaust, but their story of survival from the death march is a book in itself. It won't be all included in mine, but absolutely amazing, humbling. It shows that even in times of having spent 3 years in this horrific place, how these young girls still had a moral fibre about them as they encountered incidents and people on their death march, when they ran from it, particularly when they escaped from it. When they got back to Slovakia and they went back to Vranov and they were turned away from their family home, and that'll all play out in the book. They found themselves back in Bratislava like other survivors, but they weren't welcome there either. So what do three young girls with no other family do? Well, you get yourself into the forests of Czechoslovakia, don't you? And you train to be a freedom fighter. And these three young girls found themselves being smuggled into Romania and then to Transylvania and then on a ship. And there they made their way to Palestine. And they became part of the people who fought for the state of Israel. And once again, incredible stories of just three ordinary girls who lived in extraordinary times. And these are the stories, I think, that resonate with people. And I'm going to be so delighted to start writing the story. I've got many notes. I've got recordings. To be the older sister, you're hearing, by the way, much more about this than really anybody else knows other than my publishers, but that's okay. It's between you and me, right? But Sibby, who I naturally didn't get to meet because she died a couple of years ago, she was the older sister. It's interesting, all three girls have, of course, totally different personality traits that help them survive. And in hearing about them, and it's wonderful being surrounded when I'm sitting in Livia's lounge room with 20 members of her family, 3 generations, actually 4 now. There was a little tiny great-grandson there too. They all talking 10 to the dozen, and they're all sharing, because here's where these 3 girls seem to have differed from many other survivors and survivors' families I've met. This is where they differed incredibly. They had told their children from the day that they could understand about their time in Auschwitz, Birkenau. Those adults now, they're in my age, they're in their sort of 60s. They have known all their life of what their mothers, and their fathers too, because they subsequently ended up marrying survivors too, endured and what their time was like. There was no secrets. They have not held back in sharing their horror and what they endured. And so it makes it very easy for them to be able to enrich the stories, because they have talked about them all their lives. Now, Sibby, she had a written short testimony made several years ago, and Olivia's daughter, she had the book, and she sat down one night with Olivia and I, and it was serious because Olivia, being the younger sister, she had not bothered to read her older sister's testimony, had she? Why should she? She knew the story. So it was quite a wonderful evening sitting with her and her daughter reading and translating from Hebrew in English for me, and I recorded it on my phone. And Olivia, all these years later, saying, "Really? Did that happen to Zippy?" She was there, but of course everybody's memory is different. And things that Zippy wrote about in her testimony, even though her own sister was there with her, Olivia had not seen and had not understood, because she was the youngest, the baby. And she admitted to me that she, in fact, spent a lot of her time in Birkenau in what she called a zombie state. And that doesn't seem to be unusual, that disassociating yourself from what's going on around you as a method of survival. But Sibby didn't. She took it up to every person in authority she could. She got into trouble time and time again with the SS, with her capo. She even challenged, Kramer, and that part of that story, which relates to when their mother and grandfather came into the camp. Shocking. Such was to be, and to sit there and
sorry to interrupt. We need some good few minutes for questions. So how are you going?
I've got plenty of time, but please, anyone, ask questions, and
yes,
and I'll try and answer them. Anything.
Yes. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Anyone? Otherwise, we'll just head. Ariella?
If you can put your hand up, and then I'll unmute you.
And then Ariella will unmute you. Some people we can't see their faces, so that's
Lily. Oh, Lily, you need to unmute yourself.
I bet she hasn't been asked to do that too many times in her life.
Yes.
Unmute yourself.
Okay.
Asked to mute yourself.
Unmuted.
Hello.
My children would like to mute me permanently. I just want to say this is the most riveting, exciting, magnificent talk I've ever heard in my whole life.
Oh, thank you, honey.
I read a ginormous amount of books, and I can't wait to get yours.
Oh, look, thank you.
I'm Jackie's mum.
Hence Jackie going, yes, mute her again, Jackie. Go on, I dare you to.
Thank you.
Look, I keep coming back, and the word lucky was a word that that Lally used, and many survivors I've used when I'd say to them, what do you put down your survival to? And they would just say, luck. I was lucky. Lally would say it 3 times. I was lucky, lucky, lucky. But, and I now use it too, because I'm the lucky one that they got to meet him. But please, any other questions? Otherwise, I'll just carry on.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No, as I can talk.
Eva.
But even you need to unmute yourself as well, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I've read both of your books. I've really enjoyed them. I'm enjoying your talk. I've been to the talks at the library and also the town hall. I enjoyed it, but could you please talk more about Lally Sokolov and Tattooist of Auschwitz and the research?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, not a problem. Okay, so yes, when Lally told me his story, I was really aware of the fact that this was the memory of one man, and that there may be things here that he remembered that would not gel with the facts that are recorded, because historians and academics, of course, are the ones who mostly record, for publication anyway, stories of the Holocaust. Of course, we know that Steven Spielberg has got some 50,000 plus testimonies in a vault somewhere in California, and good on him. And boy, do I give a shout out to him every chance I can for what he's done. But in terms of being able to research Lali's story, we use professional researchers in Germany and Poland. Now, they uncovered several documents, and given the vast majority got destroyed there, we did get many documents with Lali's name. Some of them only had his number, but that's okay, name, number, it was one and the same person. We got those documents, and we absolutely got the proof of who he was, where he came from, the date he was taken in. We got the document that has the heading written on it that says political wing. It says politischer Abteilung, but that translates to political wing, with his name underneath and his number saying the role he had in Birkenau. We got the document showing that he was arrested in Birkenau on this day and taken to the penal unit in Auschwitz, where he was beaten and interrogated for 6 weeks. That document has the date he was arrested, taken to Auschwitz, and the date that he was then released from Auschwitz. We do not know why. There's no way, even Lali has no idea why he was not taken outside next door to the Black Wall and shot like many others. But he was returned to Birkenau. And it was that return to Birkenau that he should not have survived. And that was where Cilka saved his life, by her asking that one favor. And you know, she told Gita many, many years later when they met, that asking the Commandant Schwarzhuber to save Lali was the only thing she ever asked of that man. She just endured him for 2+ years and asked that one favor. So you can see why Lali owes his life to her. So we did have that research. And when I was trying to bring it together, and some of it was not, I wasn't getting clarification of some of the storylines and getting caught up in the whole notion of, well, what do I write, what don't I write? That's when I woke up one morning and just went, oh, you know, sod it. I come back to this. I'm not telling the story of the Holocaust. I'm just telling a Holocaust story. And from that moment on, I was totally at peace with myself with how I would tell his story. But you know, here's the bugger of it, guys. Since his story has come out, several of the significant storylines of Lali that are not in the book, because I thought they needed to have had a second piece of evidence because they're important, I didn't put them in. But now I have been contacted by people in other countries who confirm, because of either the survivor themselves or a family member who remembers him, and they confirm some of those storylines that I didn't put in. We talked about maybe writing, doing a second edition and including these in, but what we're doing instead, and this pleases me, I didn't say, but I initially wrote his story, by the way, as a screenplay, but if you've been to my talks, you know that. So what we're doing, the book is not going to be made into a film, but it's in development to be made into a 6-part miniseries. Filming was meant to have begun in Poland this month. And of course, it's now delayed. But in there, we will be putting in some of those other storylines that I never had my second piece of evidence. Let me tell you about one of them, because now Lali was really cranky with me that I never had in his story. And because he read the screenplay, many drafts, not the book. And he was cranky and he'd go, I want you to tell the story of Mordovich. And I go, I can't, Lali, you know, that man, he's written in history. I found a connection between your name and his. By the way, I did not look close enough because we have subsequently found it. But he kept saying Mordovich to me, and me saying no. And then after the book came out, I got an email from a reporter in Toronto in Canada. I'm beginning to like people who live in Toronto in Canada. And he wrote to me and he said, I'm writing a belated obituary for a man called Czesław Mordovich. He spoke about your guy. Did your guy speak about mine? I wrote back 2 words, hell yeah. Now this man and I corresponded, and he subsequently sent me the testimony of Mordovich. He had it translated from Polish into English, and he was writing about him. The Auschwitz Protocol, that document written by the 4 men who escaped from Birkenau, Wetzlar, Werber, Ernst, Mordovich. those 4 men who wrote that document, that significant document we now know. Well, Mordovich, he came across Lully in Birkenau. He sought him out because Mordovich, he was, I think, about 18 or 19. And in about April 1944, he escaped from Birkenau, but he got caught. And he got caught and he got brought back to Birkenau because he had a tattooed number on his arm. And so the Germans knew where he came from. He got brought back and he was taken to Lully. And Lully told me, and even in Mordovich's testimony, his own words, I went to the Tattooist Lully and I asked him, you must save me. People tell me that you can save me. And Lully told me, I said to him, I can't. You know you will be hung. You get hung for just trying to escape, let alone succeeding. And he was distressed and he said, people say you can help me. And yet, you know, Lully had helped do things that, again, I have not put in the book because I never had second evidence. But he begged Lully, and Lully said to him, there is only one thing I can do, but it means you have to escape again. So Lully changed his number on his arm, the number. He went and worked on it and turned it into a rose. Now I have a photo of elderly Mordovich holding his arm up, and you can still vaguely see the imprint of now what is a rose, not numbers. And other prisoners then helped Mordovich escape, and he escaped that time with the man Ernst. And these 2 men did escape. They got back to Bratislava. They met up with Werber and Wetzler, the 2 who had escaped several weeks earlier. And when I was in Bratislava talking to people there about the document and it being written, they actually said to me, you know, we were actually told that these 4 men, when they got together, they got on the Slivovitz. Well, for any of you who have been to Slovakia and drunk Slivovitz, you will know that if you get on the Slivovitz for 2 weeks, you're not capable of saying anything, let alone writing anything. But after 2 weeks, they then did write this document. Now, history tells us that that document got smuggled to Sweden, and from Sweden it got smuggled to Washington and London. We're talking about July 1944 now, when 10,000 Jewish men, women and children per day are leaving Budapest and being taken to Auschwitz, to Birkenau, 10,000. Washington, Roosevelt, he sent a message after he read that document to the puppet president, granted, of Hungary, saying he knew what was going on and he had this document. And that president, that man, he did stop those transportations. I'm told 170,000 Jewish men, women and children did not leave Budapest after that word got to the president from Washington. Now, Lully's role in telling that story was simply to change his name to his number to a rose, and then with others help him escape. Significant to Lully because he had a role in it. You can see why I couldn't put that in his book because of the significance of Mordovich. But I now have Mordovich's own words, his own testimony, and a photo of him holding out his arm saying, I survived because of Lully. So that is just one of other stories that have come to me from survivors about what he did for them and saving them.
Incredible. I think maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions, Ariella.
I think one more. Oh, here we go.
Natalie.
Oh.
Natalie.
Hi, H. Always lovely to hear from you and see you. Can you tell us a bit about your upcoming book and what we can expect to read in that one, please?
My Stories of Hope. You are going to hear me say how if, I think it's become a bit of a lost art, but if we can re-find, and for many of us keep, the art of listening to others, that we will be the richer for it. I talk about how if you listen to your elders, listen to your children. When I was writing that chapter and I was talking to my own children, I was like, oh, look, I'm writing about listening to your children. And they went, you're not qualified to write that. We don't think you listen to us one bit. So I've made them promise that I will listen to my grandchildren better. But I did listen to them. And actually, you know what? You'll read in there a little vignette about how, in fact, I didn't listen to my own daughter only a few months ago. But if I was listening to her, I was not hearing her. And she and her husband have given me permission to write about a very, very painful time in their life when, with a newborn baby, my daughter was struggling with 2 other children and a newborn. And we did not hear her unspoken pleas of how she was not coping. And yes, the postnatal depression that she was in that we did not recognize. And I'm her mum, I should have. And how the potential for that to have, gone very, very bad for us was there. And it took her finally one day, breaking down in front of her husband and I and saying, "Why aren't you listening to me?" Well, she wasn't saying anything verbally, but my goodness, her body language was saying plenty. So even now, I can be brought up to say, listen. So I do share that with you, and I'm very, very grateful that she and her husband have given me permission to tell you that. So those are the sorts of things I talk about, how if we don't listen sometimes, not do we run the risk of harming somebody, which potentially I could have there, but we miss out on so much. And I love it that my 5- and 3-year-old grandchildren, who, by the way, are currently living with me because their new built home is not quite ready. So it might seem quiet to you here, but they're currently in my house, are 22 extra feet. A mum, a dad, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 10-month-old, a dog, and 2 cats. So I'm doing well to talk to you without, the dogs come in and visited me a few times.
Yes, we've heard a bit of that. That's been interesting.
But so that's what I'm trying to just say to people, but in a non-threatening way, that listen and you will grow. And Nat, you, a social worker extraordinaire, this young woman who I am so privileged to know and have worked with and call my friend, because I see and have seen for years the good work that she does, because she listens and she makes a difference in people's lives at a time of tragedy and trauma.
Wow.
Thanks, Age, but you've also done an amazing job, which is probably why you're so experienced to be able to share these stories, and why Lally would have wanted to speak to you to start this all off, and why so many people have reached out to you since then. So thank you, and thanks for keep on sharing our story alive, really.
I won't stop.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye, honey. We will catch up.
I think then I will just have be calling upon Bella. Was there one more question, Ariella?
Sylvia,
yes, that's our last question. Sylvia?
I actually have 2 questions. Is that all right?
go for it.
Right. So first of all, you said that with Cilka, she and other people who were sex slaves didn't want to admit that. But I read an article that only one person had ever interviewed her, and she denied that she was a sex slave. Maybe she did that because she didn't want people to know. But her husband had said that they had vowed that they would never talk about what happened during the war, and they wanted to keep it secret. Don't you think that to honour that right of hers, that maybe you should have made it fiction, not used her real name?
Look, really happy to answer that. In terms of, actually, if you continue to read that, it was her husband who broke that vow. And so Cilka then decided that she was going to talk about it. That person who said that she would not talk to him about it was a man, and a man that she met through her husband. Now, I was talking to other women who she spoke to, and they were telling me a different story. So it makes sense, doesn't it? Why would this woman now in her 70s openly talk about her shame? And she would have felt shamed by it to a male. And these women who were her neighbours and friends for years, they said that to me too. You know, she never talked about it in front of their husbands. It was something that the women spoke about. So I don't think I've dishonored her in naming her. Quite the opposite. These women who knew her, I would ask them, what would Cilka say? You knew her. What would she say about me telling her story? Do you think Cilka would come and sit with me and talk to the public or to the media about her time? And they said, I think she would be quietly delighted that someone is talking about that sexual abuse that she and many, many others endured. They said, I think she would have come with you, but she probably wouldn't have said very much. So no, look, I appreciate, and I really thank you for your question. But to me, she said that to a male. Her female friends told me something different.
Okay, and can I ask you another question?
As long as it's quick, because a lot of people have just an hour.
Okay. You said that you haven't told the story of the Holocaust, just one story that happened in the Holocaust. But my fear is that if that's the only book that someone reads about the Holocaust, and you said that you were being creative, and I know from people, my parents and my parents' friends, that there were inaccuracies in your book about Auschwitz. And don't you think that's a danger in having a book, like not stating at the beginning that it's fiction, partly based on truth, and not using the people's names? Because if that's the only book people read about the Holocaust, they're not getting the reality.
First of all, we do say up front that this is a book of fiction. That's very clearly in the front. We say very clearly this is based on the true story of Lale Sokolov. And look, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but if this is the only book a 16-year-old reads in their backstage Milwaukee, and they hear about the Holocaust only through the story, isn't that better than not hearing about it at all? And for me, can I tell you the number of people who, the Auschwitz Museum, I suspect that they probably are a bit cranky with me, because I can tell you thousands of people have said to me, I am now going to Auschwitz because I read your book. So the number of people who have actually now gone and wanted to learn more has been phenomenal. And if it just starts a conversation with somebody in a family. And so look, with reference, I beg that that's the only book that it can cause harm. I don't accept that, unfortunately. Well, no, I just can't accept that.
Why couldn't you?
We're going to have to, Sylvia, we're going to have to stop the thing now, because people are leaving the group because they've only had just
right.
over.
Let me just say this about why Lale spoke to me, because it's important for you to know that. He had been asked his son to find somebody to tell his story to who wasn't Jewish. He was so clear on that. And when I questioned him the first day I met him, why do you want someone who's not Jewish? He said, there is not a person alive on this planet who is Jewish who is not touched by the Holocaust. They all will have their own backstory and their family story, which would impinge on them telling mine. And he was so clear on that. And so, yes, I was a greenskin coming in and having to learn about the Holocaust from Lale. But I come back to it. That is his memory. He read many, many drafts of the storyline written as a screenplay. And I chose to honor his telling of his story. And we say it's been fiction. By the way, the only thing in his story that I created was I put him and Gita together when those Allied planes flew over Birkenau. They weren't. That is the only thing I got created. Everything else is as he's told me. And I accept it will differ from everyone else's version of being there.
Wonderful. I'm now going to hand over to Bella, our chair, to do the vote of thanks for this incredible, incredible event. Bella.
Heather, I can't thank you enough. Inspirational as always, but the most important thing, whether the facts are 100% or not quite 100%, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, both from Auschwitz. Whether those facts are absolute or not, you keep the story of the Holocaust alive. Yeah. You honour the Jewish people. There are so many people now like David Irving who are denying the Holocaust. there are people all around the world. Anti-Semitism is growing at an alarming rate. People forget or they choose to forget. But if people like you can keep it alive through stories, fact, based on fact, partly fiction, it doesn't matter. You're doing an incredible job in honouring the Jewish community, in keeping our story alive by not denying it and by spreading it. And I think that's also why our organisation, JNForever, is so important, and we have to keep supporting JNForever because this is our legacy and our future based on a horrific past. So Heather, I cannot thank you enough. You're absolutely inspirational. I have read both your books. I think I'm one of your groupies. I go to any talk and giving, because of your commitment and your ability to tell our story. Thanks, Heather.
Look, thank you. And look, just in terms of how this is continuing and will be told for a long time to come, you know, we have a young adult version of this book out here in Australia and in the UK. Yesterday, I spoke to 3 different schools into New South Wales. 2 o'clock this afternoon, I will be linking into another school there. Tomorrow, the next day, I am now talking into schools with up to 200 students at a time. And so whether it is the complete story of the Holocaust or just a story, like I say, I am now reaching students from as young as 12 years of age on a daily basis in large numbers. And I will continue to do that all around the world. And I will wake up at 3:30 tomorrow morning, because at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, I am doing a Zoom meeting into this London synagogue.
Wow.
Where, once again,
I take it off to you, Heather, and congratulations. You're doing an amazing job.
Unbelievable. We need to clone you. We need to clone you. And thank you so very, very much for your time today, and everybody for being here. And we will let you know the next event, which will probably be in the next few weeks, as they, you know, we can do things. Heather, once again, absolutely superb. I could sit here all day listening to you. But